Hi, my name is Ellie Shipman and I'm a participatory artist and illustrator. This talk is just going to be a little bit about my background and my practice since graduating from Chelsea College of Art back in 2011. I want to share with you some of my favourite projects as well as some things I've learnt along the way that I hope might help you in your own creative practice. I'll start at the beginning, and my first tip is to remember the early days. This might be remembering something that you enjoyed as a creative as a child, or that's something that you pursued and were interested in when you were studying your foundation or your degree or even your master's if you're now graduated. And I think it's really important to go back to those early projects because I think there's something very pure about them often, there's something very instinctive, and I think that's really important to remember as artists as we develop in our practice. This was my degree show project. It's called Untitled with Art from London. And this is what I did at Chelsea College of Art for the BA Fine Art degree show in 2011. So this was a Victorian market stall which I had dragged over Lambeth Bridge from Lower Marsh, where I was living near at the time. I was really interested in what made community in London, and being a student in London, you're part of a very transient community which is constantly changing. You're moving house every year or so, and it's very kind of very transient and very unsettling, I suppose. And alongside my own kind of moving around, there's also just the movement of the city. So there was just new buildings being developed all the time, communities being pushed out of social housing, tourism and regeneration happening concurrently with residential developments and people just trying to get by and live their lives, as well as with independent shops and independent businesses. I was really interested in how, as a student, I would be walking over Lambeth Bridge on my way to uni from home and would see tourist market stalls all over the place with like Union Jack hats and umbrellas with, the St George Cross on them and all sorts of like tourist tat basically. And I was interested in what that represented about being in London and being a Londoner, and this kind of image that people were buying into very literally. So for this piece, I wanted to make an alternative souvenir stall. I was very interested in the local charities and arts organisations working around the area that I was living in, and was interested in the dynamic between these like local community-led creative organisations and then the kind of craziness of regeneration and the urban change that was going on in the city, and obviously still is and always will be, I suppose. So for this piece, I was making alternative souvenirs with different community groups around the area. So these umbrellas were made with an older person's group, and I would ask them to draw an alternative London skyline of their favourite buildings. So all these buildings were the community's favourite buildings and places, which featured on these lovely white umbrellas. These t-shirts on either side were they were photos taken of local independent shop owners from the neck down, so you could sort of wear a local person for that authentic experience. These hoodies at the back were screen printed of things that people hated about London. So it's like I heart / hate tower blocks, chicken and chip shops, dog shit was one of them. And I was really interested in these kind of mechanisms of consultation and how when you ask someone, you ask communities what they love about the area, you don't often say, what do you hate about the area? And I think it's important to have both in the conversation. And then these chicken boxes were made with a youth group in the area with young people who were out of standard kind of mainstream education, and they were learning horticultural practices. So for these chicken boxes, they're actually seed bombs made into the shape of chicken legs, and they have salad and herb seeds in. And particularly around South London, you just see chicken bones on the floor all over the place from these chicken boxes, or you did at the time, I was there anyway. And I was interested in engaging this youth group in kind of taking back some of that ownership of them and making them into something that maybe would be more positive. So this was the first piece of participatory work that I really had ever done, and it really enlightened me and made me just feel like this is the kind of practice I want to be pursuing in my career, just meeting people and working with them and developing work with them, helping people see their own creativity who might not see themselves as artists. So that really set me on a path of becoming a participatory artist. Alongside the degree show, my thesis was something which I do also still remember and refer back to from my early days. The thesis title was Regenerate, Disintegrate, Create, the Role of Temporary Public Art in Regeneration. And it was really exploring what the degree show was exploring as well, in terms of how creativity in cities and in urban regeneration can be used for good, basically. And I was looking at lots of different temporary public art projects which, you know, had been shoehorned in or were using to kind of try and fix or alleviate social issues, but then I was trying to develop ideas around ways that it can be done positively and done well. For example, Grisdale Arts and Commissions East and the collective Somewhere, I thought were all doing some really interesting stuff around engaging communities in different ways, and being very creative with it. This was my first residency. It was called Play Swap, that was my project title, and it was living in a community centre and shared house, and it really was kind of the same building, which was quite bizarre. It had a church upstairs, community centre downstairs, and then next door the house was like this old Victorian house, but it also linked through to the church hall. So the idea with Pembroke House is that it's actually a university settlement, so if you're going to live in the house, you give back to the community in exchange for reduced rent. So I was the first artist to be commissioned to do a project there. This was in 2012, a year after graduating. And this project was called Play Swap because I was really interested in engaging the community, from children to older people, around play. The brief for the residency was to bring people of different cultural and religious backgrounds together. And it's something that I wanted to do without having to say to people, what ethnicity are you? What culture do you feel you associate yourself with? What religious background do you have? I felt like they were very personal questions and maybe would result in people not wanting to answer or feel like it's just, why would they need to give you that information? So instead I thought, well, what is something that unites us all, that's very common, that's something that we can all take part in, and that we've all done since we were children, no matter what our background. And I thought play was a really interesting kind of common denominator through everyone. So I started asking people, what games did you play as a child? And then the natural next question was, where was that? So then I was able to ask people at least where they grew up. And that was a really nice way of just working out that actually this community is extremely diverse, people have come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and everyone did have play in common. So the project worked in, I was doing weekly workshops where I was saying it was open to any age to come and play. We were coming to share games from our own childhood, so I worked with the lunch club of a group of older people and asked them to share games from their childhood. And it was really interesting to see how people enjoyed the games, how people enjoyed sharing them with me and sharing them with each other. I also did this market stall. This was on East Street Market in Elephant and Castle. And market stalls, as with my degree show, I found a really interesting mechanism because they invite this kind of exchange. And yes, there's like a monetary exchange there, but there's also a sort of platform between yourself as the artist and the viewer or the customer, I guess. And so people kind of come up to see what's going on, and I felt like that was a really natural way of engaging with people rather than, say, going up to someone with a clipboard or with a questionnaire or something and trying to engage them in a different way. So that was a mechanism that I used quite a lot in that project. The project ended by making a film that we launched, which was like an 11-minute short film. We had a launch event for it with 80 people from the local community, and then we documented the games as well. So I had over 100 games that I collected, and the games in the film are now in Southwark Local History Archives. So I feel really proud of this project because it's really, it operated as an art project, but there were also these other outputs which were able to have some kind of legacy from them. This project was in 2014 and it was with Pump House Gallery in Battersea in London. And it was a participatory project again, working with Year 3 students from a local school to the gallery. And 4 artists were commissioned to work with different local schools and develop this kind of creative project from them. And this was mine. It was called I Survive. And it was a slight tongue-in-cheek look at climate change and inviting children to try and consider these alternative futures and alternative environments and how we might survive in them. So these were two of the dens that we made. So we made 4 dens, and I was particularly interested in inviting the children to do different things in their daily life at school. So I went in for a couple of sessions to their classrooms, and we did a walk around Battersea Park where we were making dens in the trees and in the bushes around Battersea Park. And then we also got these den materials and brought them into the classroom, pushed all the tables to one side, and invited the children to get into teams of 5 or so and make these dens themselves. And it was very interesting because at that age in year 3, children aren't often asked to collaborate in teams like that. And to see their little personalities coming through, and as they were leading teams and working together, was really lovely, and something which I think they wouldn't have done in school at that age otherwise. So I was really pleased with that, and they came up with these amazing creations of this. This blue one is a floating den, a floating structure to survive in water, and this yellow one is survival in the desert. So it's got these kind of heat-proof outer layers on it. And then the exhibition invited other people to participate by writing their own survival tips on these kind of clips and adding them on the wall. Dens and recycled materials are something which comes up again and again in my work, and this project from 2015 was with the South Bank Centre in London, and I was commissioned to do some kind of engaging creative workshop for basically X number of people in the Claw Ballroom at the South Bank Centre as part of David Byrne's Meltdown Festival. So this was a children and families activity, so it needed to be very accessible for any age child and something people could just drop in and out of. So what we did is I made a treasure hunt map of the whole of the South Bank Centre, and then the South Bank collected different recycled materials for me, which was a great help. And then at each point on the treasure map, there was like a wood collection point, a cardboard collection point, a plastic, and then the children and their families could go and collect their materials and then bring them to the Claw Ballroom and make this recycled island, as we called it. So it was filmed from the top down, so you can see just behind on this projection screen, it was projected so we could see the shape of this island starting to take shape. And then children just came in and out all day and just played and made and did whatever they wanted. So that was a really, really exciting project, and I just loved engaging people in that way and seeing what they came up with. They were really creative. I've reflected a lot in my creative practice, particularly through studying again, and in 2015 I went back to university and studied Masters in Sustainable Development at the University of the West of England. Again, I wrote a thesis quite similar to my first BA thesis around temporary public art, but this one was particularly around participatory art and how it can use community development methodologies to help catalyse more climate resilient communities. So alongside this Masters, I was working part-time at Bristol City Council in community development. So I was going out into communities and asking people what they'd like to do to improve their local area, to meet their neighbours, to work together, to be creative as well, and using this asset-based approach, which is the ABCD, asset-based community development, which is all about having a kind of knowledge exchange, listening to people, and going where the spark is for communities to develop their own projects and initiatives. So that work really informed my thesis as well as my own experience doing participatory art. So this toolkit of recommendations came from bringing those 3 areas together around the climate resilience, the participatory art and the community development. So I'll run through some of these and share some insights with you. So the first one is simply listen to the community and ask what they can do. This seems really straightforward, but so often artists and community development workers and other creative community facilitators don't ask the community what they would like to do or what they can do, and instead go in with their own ideas, their own project, and expect people to get on board. So I think it should go the other way around, where you scope out the community, you talk to people, you get to know people, and see what they might like to do and how that might be able to feed into a more collaborative project you could develop together. The second one is gain permission, build trust, participate and share your story. And this for me is really about not coming in as a kind of high and mighty artist, but coming in as a regular human being and exchanging your own story or your own opinions with local people, and just basically being on a level with people. Definitely gaining permission to start any kind of creative project is essential, whether it's legal permissions to do an event somewhere or whether it's just a kind of more informal permission about working in a particular community. It's just really important to meet people where they're at, gain permission from them, build trust and develop something together. Number 3 is provoke curiosity through the artwork. What is your hook? So for this, particularly with participatory work, I love doing things which are really visual, which are really bold in public space, which invites people to get involved and have that kind of interaction with you, which they otherwise might have just wandered past if you were by yourself. So having some kind of hook, some kind of visual boldness or some kind of engagement technique to invite people to get involved, whether it's putting on food, whether it's having free refreshments. And I know it sounds really simple, but it really is vital to enable that interaction to start to take place. Number 4 is share and build climate knowledge collectively. Now this again could apply to any kind of knowledge, but again it's about having that knowledge exchange and the expert and the local person not being these separate entities, but being able to have this kind of more fluid conversation. Number 5 is partner with others and build your support network. This is so vital as artists to have a solid group of peers and colleagues and friends around us which we can collaborate with, which we can support each other through these different projects that we're doing. Number 6 is know it's okay to just be an art project, but be aware of your role. For this one, it's really about how socially engaged art and participatory art can be kind of shoehorned into these different environments, as I was saying earlier, and used in a way which is political, which is social, which is environmental. And it's just really important to know the context, the political and socio-political context of what you're doing and where your art might be used. Number 7 is aim for the artwork to be environmentally, ethically and economically sustainable. So with sustainability, we often just think about the environmentally sustainable element and sometimes we don't think about the economic sustainability of it. And it's really important as artists to be able to economically sustain ourselves. This is something that back when I was studying, we weren't often taught about how to actually make a living as an artist. And it's totally okay to be working another part-time job, to be teaching courses somewhere, to be doing workshops, to be illustrating, to have these other outputs in your creative practice. It's also really important to know when to say no, when a project might be paid too low, when you can't fit it in if you're already busy. And that's totally fine. I think it certainly took me a long time to learn to say no to things, but I think knowing your value, knowing your worth, and knowing when you've reached capacity or the value of your day rates, for example, should be capped, and it's good to have that marker in your mind and be confident in that. Number 8 is catalyse, even in a small way. So for me, participatory projects are all about engaging people and hopefully sparking something in them which they might not have otherwise been aware of or they might not have otherwise come across. Number 9 is evidence your impact but know why and who for. So often for participatory projects you might be asked to record numbers, to record demographics, to record quotes and feedback from your participants, but you need to know why and who for. Is that for the funders? Is it for an advertisement? Is it to develop some other kind of project? So it's really important to ask those questions when you're asked to record that impact. And number 10 is have hope. I think particularly in these really challenging times we're living through, it's so important to just keep hope, have hope, and project that out onto the people that you're working with and around. So again, reflecting on what works, a kind of project structure in my usual participatory practice has emerged over the years I've been working. And that usually consists of meeting a community group, doing some creative workshops with that group and getting to know them, taking some element of those creative workshops, whether it's drawing or audio or photography, and then developing that output into a final piece or project. So this project is an example of that, the Time Capsule project. I was asked to develop a mural for a wall in a garden of a care home for people with dementia. And I said I would love to do the project, but I'd love if it could be a participatory project and not just a simple wall piece. So I ended up meeting with the members of the day centre, the older people with dementia, and inviting a local school from Elephant and Castle of Year 7 girls to come in and work with the people with dementia in the centre. And we developed these different participatory workshops together where we were looking at different periods of time and different themes from those periods, like fashion, food, music, objects from our own lives. And then we were collating that information together through drawing, through audio, through making collage, and all sorts of different other outputs. And we ended up making these patterns from people's drawings, which informed this aluminium quilt, as I called it, which was basically a digitally printed series of aluminium panels put together, which made the resulting mural. For this project, we also made a podcast where the young students would be interviewing the older people about these different periods of time in their lives. And we also made a newspaper which were given out to all the participants and their families as a kind of thank you and legacy of the project. So I was really pleased with this artwork. It really felt like it embodied all these different stages of what I feel works well in my projects. And now it's a permanent artwork, and we did make a time capsule for it as well, which is buried underneath the mural. I used a similar structure for this project called Here, There to Be a Woman. This was commissioned by researchers who were exploring gender-based violence through their research at the University of Bristol. And I collaborated with an author and writer and women's rights journalist, Sian Norris, for this project. And we co-ran workshops together exploring writing and poetry, embroidery and drawing. So we just had 4 workshops with a group of refugee women from Iraqi Kurdistan and Syria, and we were working with the women to explore what it meant to be a woman in Syria or Iraqi Kurdistan and in Bristol where they were living. Talking about gender-based violence is obviously an extremely difficult and very sensitive topic, so we really wanted these 4 workshops to be a light touch exploration which enabled the women to share as much or as little as they liked. So we wanted to explore this question of what it was to be a woman, to enable those comments and thoughts to come out if they wanted to, but also to provide a safe and welcoming space for people to just talk about their experiences of their own lives. So the outputs from the workshops where we had written poetry and done embroidery and drawing and word association resulted in the design of these 2 fabrics and the upholstery of these 2 different chairs. So the first one is this kind of Middle Eastern style floor cushion set, and the second is a kind of Western style mid-century sofa. And you can see on this fabric that the words that the women have written, the association of being in their home countries, were all around the edges. The poetry is on the side cushions, and the drawings, these were drawn by the women, a couple of them were artists in the group as well, of fig leaves and of walnut leaves around it. And then on the other side, this sponge drawing represents an object that one of the women brought in to share the association of being a woman in the UK. And she had lost her job as an actress and filmmaker in Kurdistan, and was now a stay-at-home mum, just washing up and cleaning up after her family as she felt. So it was about this repetitiveness of this sponge image and then the words associated with being in the UK behind them. This residency was called Our City, Our Health, and it was commissioned by UWE and researchers doing a project all around public health and urban planning. This project was really about working out creative mechanisms to engage and invite communities to get involved with the project and seeing how their own priorities for their local area might impact public health decision making. So it was quite a consultancy based project, but I wanted to develop these visual ways to stop people in the street, to invite people to get involved, to make it fun and engaging, and also to feed back real data into the research as well. So I developed these sticker designs for the research categories, which were the areas of public health people were being asked about. And then these stickers were then put on these tags and taken around on a banner led by local children or local residents in 3 different areas of Bristol where the research was taking place. And again, like the children were inviting people to write their own ideas and opinions on the tags and then pin them onto the map as they walked it around the local area. And again, this was a really effective way of engaging people and a lovely kind of output that built up over time. And that's something I really love to explore in my practice, is having something which develops and changes as people contribute to it. Utilising your strengths is a really important way of developing your practice and bringing in elements of what you enjoy and what you're good at into your daily work. For me, I love sewing and designing, so I've really tried to bring those into my projects as I've developed them. This project was an exhibition called Inventions and Imaginings. It was at the Island in Bristol in 2018. It was also commissioned by the University of Bristol. And it was about engaging local people and members of the public with research and again prompting a knowledge exchange around this kind of creative platform. So I asked researchers to bring in different objects from their various labs and their various research areas which might provoke curiosity for members of the public. And then on the objects we had labels saying please touch, to invite people to pick them up, engage with them and interact with them. And then I also invited people to write their own museum-style labels for the objects to imagine what they might be used for. We had these white plinths made so that they were all at kind of relatively eye height or kind of human level height, to really invite people to look very closely at these objects and add their own descriptions onto them. This project again used digitally printed fabric, and another area I've been developing recently around pattern design. This was a residency commissioned by Norwest Media Centre in 2018 in Bristol, and it was all about engaging local people in the 80th anniversary of a local community centre, Philwood Community Centre. I was interested in inviting people to contribute to the project at every stage of it. So in the first instance, I made these flyers which invited people to draw little doodles around their association with the past, present and future of Philwood as a community and as an area. So for example, this cushion, you can see this drawing of a man roller skating. And this was a local character called Stan the Man who used to roller skate all around Philwood. I did these workshops with local people where we were drawing these different designs, and then I repeated them in Illustrator and then got them printed onto fabric. And then the fabric was then also brought back to the local community for people to then make their own products out of. We Can Make was another project by Norwest Media Centre, and they asked me to come in and do some workshops engaging people in the design process of developing a new design code for new self-build eco houses in the area. We took these signs with thumbs up and thumbs down on them around these self-build areas to demonstrate what we did and didn't like, to take inspiration for the design code of the Norwest area. We then ran creative workshops inviting people to share what they loved about their own home and what they might like to change about their own home, and then connected up with string to show the kind of commonality between people. This was a massive lesson for me. I've always loved travel and I've always dreamed of living in another country for a little while. And last year, after I got married, my husband and I decided to seek a completely new adventure and go and live in Vietnam for a year. While we were in Vietnam, I was planning on having a break and having a complete kind of time out from my creative practice and maybe focusing on some other elements of it. But instead, I ended up doing loads of exhibitions and developing lots of new projects, but it was the exact kind of change of scene that I needed to feel a bit more invigorated about my practice and to give myself just a kind of mental break. Being in Vietnam gave me the opportunity to take a bit of a step back from my participatory practice and develop more installation-based works and more kind of personal projects which didn't necessarily engage members of the public. This was a really nice change for me, and it got me back to the early days of my degree where I was making installations and things people could get into and sort of interact with, and that was the kind of first step in my work as a social artist anyway. So as we got to know local people and I became involved in the local art scene, we started putting on our own exhibitions. So this first exhibition was called Flux, an exhibition of a changing city. And it exhibited 6 different artists, myself included, with 3 expats and 3 local Vietnamese artists, and invited us to all respond to this theme of what being in flux means to us. So this piece, State of Being, on the left here, this motorbike helmet, was all about my personal and initial response to being in Hanoi, which is a city of I think it's like 5 million motorbikes to 3 million population or something. It's just totally mad. So there's just bikes everywhere you look. The streets are really thriving and busy, but it can be really overstimulating and overwhelming. This piece reflected on the fact that a lot of people don't wear helmets as well, but reflected on my own kind of state of being, of kind of my mental well-being and the kind of overwhelm I was feeling, but also the kind of the hyper stimulation I was feeling from looking in all these different directions, from having all these different perspectives on life suddenly being thrown at me all at once. I've always gone back and forth on actually making objects, because part of what I love about participatory practice is making objects and then giving them sort of as gifts to the communities involved. But this was actually making an artwork as a sculptural piece itself, which I did then sell later on. So that was a really nice kind of conclusion to that piece. So behind it is this dress that you can just see in this image. It was called Dress Ectasis, and it was all about shedding a new skin as I was moving to this new city. And this tarpaulin, this like stripy, pink and blue stripy tarpaulin, is seen absolutely everywhere in Hanoi. It's used on every building site, it's hanging from every building. So I thought it was this really interesting visual symbol which is very, very specific to Hanoi, but also represented this kind of shedding of my own skin in this new place, as the city itself is shedding skin and kind of growing new layers. So I made this dress and then took it around the city and did a photo series of it in different places, which were also part of the exhibition. And again, for me, photography is not usually an output of my creative practice, it's usually just used as documentation. But that was a really lovely way to actually get back to photography and look at composition and look at light and look at the subject in a completely different way. During my time in Vietnam, I took part in some different residencies as well. So this piece was made through a residency called Live, Make, Share with an organisation called Undecided Productions. This residency was a live-in residency, living in a traditional Vietnamese house in a very rural village about an hour away from Hanoi. Again, being very interested in environmentalism and sustainability, I was really struck by the air quality in Vietnam and how absolutely terrible it is, particularly in Hanoi and in the north, where there's a lot of coal producing factories in the area, and just the traffic is just absolutely terrible for the air pollution. So I was looking up how many people die from air pollution related diseases, and found that the WHO reported that in 2018, 60,000 people were supposedly to have died from air pollution related illnesses. It was such a vast number, and I wanted to do something to try and raise awareness of it, to try and recognise it, and to try and get my own head around it as well. And such a big symbol in Vietnam is the air pollution mask, or just fabric masks that people wear all the time, which globally have a very different meaning now with COVID-19 and how that has changed that kind of visual aesthetic completely. So I contacted a mask factory and asked if they had any old masks or kind of spare masks that weren't being used. And as it happened, they did. They'd made a batch the wrong size. So they had these masks which were completely unusable and were going to be recycled back into the fabric to make new ones again, but said I could use them in the interim and then send them on to be recycled. So I had this huge pile of masks arrive and made them into these funeral wreaths, these 6 funeral wreaths, which represent 10,000 deaths each. So these wreaths are usually made with flowers, with a mixture of fake and real flowers, and the kind of crepe paper around it. So it's this offering that people bring to Vietnamese funerals to pay their respects and to show their commitment to the deceased person. This was the biggest project that I got involved with on my adventure in Vietnam. So for the whole year, from January till January this year, although we got back in December, I was the artist in residence for Fashion Revolution Vietnam. And Fashion Revolution is a global movement for sustainable fashion, started in the UK but now in over 100 countries around the world. So I met Ellen Downs, the country coordinator, at an event, and she asked me to get involved in designing and being part of this small exhibition, as she said at the beginning. I felt that even though it was a voluntary position, I was able to commit some more time because we were living on less and we were able to have a bit more of a break and not be so pressured for money. So I was able to take on some unpaid work, although I didn't quite realise at the time how much of a commitment it would be, as we ended up developing this exhibition that was Really large scale exhibition in the end. It was on for a week at the Vietnamese Women's Museum, or Fashion Revolution Week in 2019. And we ended up having over, I think, around 1,300 visitors over the week it was on. Over 200 people at the opening, and we were recorded by 7 national TV channels in Vietnam at the opening night, and interviewed about what sustainable fashion was, how people could get involved, how people could support sustainable fashion initiatives in Hanoi and beyond. And it was just a really great way of having an impact and sharing my values and kind of sharing some of my own activism with a wider audience. As well as curating the exhibition with Ellen, I developed 2 new art installations for it. The one on the left, you can see these clothes hanging up, is called 80%, and it was 100 items of second-hand clothing which I had bought from a local second-hand market, and it was to represent that 80% of garment workers around the world are women. So we had 80 typically female items of clothing tied hand by hand or sleeve by sleeve in rows across the ceiling, and 20 male, typically male garments, which was trying to drill in this message that, you know, when you're buying clothes or things in the fashion industry, you're directly impacting women's lives more than men's. This piece, Faceless Fashion, was exploring the lives of garment workers around the world. Again, it was digitally printed fabric featuring illustrations that I'd drawn of real people, real garment workers that had been working in these different conditions. And the labels to the side of them was a double label in Vietnamese and in English, describing their story, describing their journey. And then people were asked to collect a scrap of fabric from this bag and take a safety pin and pin the fabric onto the portrait of the person that they felt whose story resonated most with them. So that was a really nice example of being able to interact and engage with people in a more installation-based way rather than doing a participatory project again. Something which has taken me far too long to learn is to just explore what you enjoy. So while I was in Vietnam, I really had the chance to get back to drawing and making in a really lovely, different way than I had before. I was lucky enough to take part in a textile tour to northern Thailand when I was away with the company Horticulture Textile Tours. They also do textile tours to northern Vietnam, to the hill tribes in the mountains there, and they commissioned me to develop this illustration, which was also a GIF, to show the different traditional outfits of various hill tribes in the area. It was a really lovely project to bring together my interest in fashion, sustainability, women's rights and women's lives, and to be able to focus on doing some illustration, which was a kind of time out and a break for me. I've also been exploring pattern design, and from projects like the Fillwood Fabric project, which I mentioned earlier, right into starting to design patterns which I'm hoping to license and develop for fashion and interiors projects. So this is another element to my practice which I'm starting to learn about. It's completely new to me still, but I'm taking part in lots of different online courses and different schools and design competitions to just try and develop my portfolio of pattern and see where it might lead me. This is another thing which I feel that I wasn't really taught at art school, in that you can have all these different multiple strands to your creative income, and that's totally okay. You don't have to be just an installation artist or a fine artist or participatory artist. You can also be a designer, an illustrator, or have these other kind of creative outputs that you're giving out into the world. While in Hanoi, I also started making maps. I got an iPad, which was quite a game changer for me in terms of my illustration, where I was actually able to just digitally draw and produce as much as I liked without necessarily having to have a studio of equipment with me. So that really opened my practice up to different creative digital outputs. I started designing these Hanoi maps for local people and friends, and soon the word got out and I was designing all sorts of different maps that people were giving to each other as presents of their favourite places in Hanoi. And again, it was a really lovely way, and actually reminded me a lot of my participatory practice, where I was asking people for their favourite things, of different types of things that they loved, finding out something about them, and then producing some kind of artwork which reflected what they enjoyed and what made them unique back to them. I also developed these other kind of personal map projects where I was just exploring different techniques and different drawing styles, And this one is the Isle of I, which represents my own psyche as a map, which is always a fun exercise to explore. Something which has been a really consistent part of my practice is to connect with community. And I feel like that's a really vital part of being an artist and thriving, to have this creative community around you. One of the really lovely opportunities I had to do that was through a local arts trail in my neighbourhood in Bristol. And this was in 2017, and my neighbours put on this arts trail which I helped organise and open my own home up to members of the public to come in and see what I'd been up to as well. It was a really interesting way to share participatory practice, because obviously you only have the output of the project, not the whole creative process. But actually, as the arts trail, it was almost a participatory project in itself. I was asking people to make these honest protest signs during the trail, which you can see the kind of cardboard signs here. And then I was also showing some installations I'd made, the Here There project, which I'm sitting on here. So this big heart is a piece I've used a lot for different consultancy projects, where I've been asking people what they love and what they hate about an area. As I was saying before, I've got a big cross as well. And I was asking people how they nurture themselves and inviting them to write it on a note card and add it to the heart. So it ended up being this kind of quite collaborative participatory process, which was just really great fun and a lovely way to meet my neighbours and to support the local creative community. So much more recently, since the pandemic is here and since the lockdown, I've been trying to find ways of keeping my participatory practice going and interacting with people online. With my friend, the creative producer and artist Katie Hawkins, we've been developing a virtual art club, which is a bi-weekly Google Hangouts club, where we've just been inviting like friends and friends of friends to just get involved and share something creative that we can all learn from. Whether it's a short talk or some kind of craft activity that we can all do from our own home, we've been just sharing these kind of tips and tricks for staying creative during the lockdown, and it's been a really lovely experience and way to meet new people and connect with other creatives who are also in isolation. I've also been working out ways that I can reach out to people online through recording talks like this, and also through developing a class for Skillshare on illustrated textiles. This class I've run in the flesh as a workshop, a 6-week workshop, but I'm just trying to work out ways that I can make things happen online, which is still part of my creative practice. And finally, I've been developing a project called Self-Isolating in Trees, again around connecting with my community, but in isolation and as a kind of separate entity. I've been going to local parks and nature reserves and finding trees to climb and just taking a moment to sit in the tree, to relax and be calm, and then to document the process by filming my view for 20 seconds, taking a photo of the tree and then plotting it on a public Google map and then sharing it in this kind of online zine. So this piece has also been about connecting with communities, but just in a virtual and self-led, independent way. I hope that this has given you some ideas, maybe some inspiration, and some ways to reflect and remember what you enjoy about your own creative practice. Do keep in touch and feel free to ask any questions at ellie@ellieshipman.com or connect with me on Instagram @ellieshipman. Thank you so much for watching.